Russia, or more specific Union, had a predominantly communist ideology from its formation in 1922 until its collapse in 1991. This was because the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, won the Russian Civil War and established the world's first communist state. The Russian Revolution of 1917, which resulted in the overthrow of the Tsarist regime and the Bolsheviks' assumption of power, marked the beginning of a communist rule in Russia that would last for over 7 decades. The Soviet Union under communism did succeed in reducing poverty and improving living conditions for many individuals in the country. According to some estimates, the Soviet Union's policies helped to significantly reduce poverty and inequality, with access to education, healthcare, and housing greatly improved for many Soviet citizens. In fact, the Soviet Union went from one of the least industrialized nations in the world at the time of the revolution in 1917 to an industrialized superpower by the 1950s. However, it is important to note that there are many criticisms and negative aspects associated with the Soviet Union's implementation of communism as well. The Soviet Union's communist ideology, while not universally supported, did find support and solidarity from some other countries on the international stage. This support often came from other communist or socialist countries who shared similar beliefs and goals as the Soviet Union. In the early 20th century, the ideological battle between communism and capitalism was a major factor in international relations, leading to the formation of alliances and blocs between countries based on their ideologies. The Soviet Union's support networks were primarily the other communist or socialist countries, such as the Eastern Bloc nations. The key principles and goals of communism include the collective ownership of property, the elimination of social classes, and the belief in the fair distribution of resources based on need, rather than individual wealth or property. These principles, when applied fairly and equitably, can lead to more moral outcomes in society, as they aim to promote equality and eliminate social hierarchies and exploitation. Historically, communism has had both success and failure in its implementation, with some countries experiencing positive outcomes, while others have struggled and faced economic challenges. However, communism as an ideology remains a topic of debate and discussion. The Soviet Union introduced several social and economic policies during its period of communist rule that aimed to improve living conditions, including 1. Nationalization of industries and property. In order to achieve collectivization and centrally plan the economy, the Soviet government nationalized many industries and sectors, including agriculture, banking, and manufacturing. 2. Nationalize natural resources. The Soviet government also nationalized most natural resources, including oil and gas, coal, minerals, and timber, to better control the distribution of wealth and resources within the country. 3. Free education and healthcare. The Soviet Union implemented a free public education system, including higher continuation education opportunities. The same applied to healthcare, with medical care provided free to the population. These policies aim to reduce inequality, provide social security and opportunity, and ensure a fairer distribution of resources among the population. However, it is important to note that the implementation of these policies had both positive and negative outcomes, and the effectiveness of these policies in achieving their goals varied. Continuing on, other socialist principles that the Soviet Union implemented include the development of a comprehensive welfare system with social security benefits for the population, such as pensions, sickness and unemployment benefit. The Soviet government also established public housing and utilities, such as running water and public transportation, to increase access to essential services and living standards. The Soviet Union's commitment to social welfare was significant, and despite its many economic challenges, it managed to provide basic needs and services for most of its population. Some of the policies implemented by the Soviet Union were indeed perceived as unusual or strange by many people both inside and outside the country. Here are a few examples. 1. The collectivization of agriculture. The Soviet government's policy of collectivization, which aimed to eliminate private land ownership and create collective farms, was a highly controversial and often criticized policy. 2. Centralized economic planning. The Soviet Union's implementation of a centrally planned economy, with the government making decisions on what to produce, how much to produce, and how to distribute goods, was widely considered an unorthodox approach to economic management. The Soviet Union was known for its totalitarian regime, which was characterized by a high degree of state control over all aspects of society, including the economy, education, healthcare, and culture. The government used a variety of means to control and suppress political opposition and dissent, including the use of propaganda, censorship, and state-controlled media. The Soviet government was also known for its aggressive foreign policy, particularly during the Cold War era. The Soviet Union supported and fostered the spread of communism worldwide, and it engaged in several military conflicts and proxy wars, which led to significant tensions with the Western powers. Continuation. The Soviet Union used a variety of tactics to control and monitor its citizens, including propaganda. The Soviet government heavily relied on propaganda to shape public opinion and promote the ideology of communism. This involved promoting positive images of the government and its policies, as well as vilifying the Western powers and their allies. 2. Censorship. The Soviet government tightly controlled the media and suppressed any form of dissent or criticism against the government or the communist system. 3. Political repression. The Soviet government used intimidation, surveillance, and violence to suppress dissidents and political opposition. The treatment of prisoners and farmers in the Soviet Union varied depending on the time period and the government's policies at the time. However, some general characteristics include prisoners were often subjected to harsh conditions, including poor living conditions, hard labour, and a lack of political or legal rights. 2. Farmers, especially collectivized ones, were required to turn over their produce to the state. The Soviet Union's response to protests and protests was usually to use force to suppress them. The government would often use the police or military to disperse protests and arrest or detain protesters. The Soviet government typically viewed protests as threats to its authority and would not tolerate any form of public dissent or critique, making the lives of activists and protesters difficult, which at times resulted in imprisonment, torture, and death. Continuation. The most well-known protest in the Soviet Union was the 1968 Prague Spring, which occurred in Czechoslovakia and was an attempt to reform the communist system. The Soviet Union, along with other Warsaw Pact nations, responded to the protests with a combined military invasion, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds of people, while thousands were imprisoned or exiled. In general, the Soviet police and military forces were used to crack down on protests and maintain order in the country, using force, intimidation, and often brutality.